Good morning to all of you. We are just getting started here. My name is Jenny Brennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium. And we're joined today by Dr. John Glaser, who many of you know from any number of different contexts. We'll talk with John and learn a good deal more about who John is, where he's from, what he does and has done. So I will spare us the introductions at the beginning and make sure we're getting everybody who is in the waiting room coming in as I speak. Perhaps, Lynn, you can put up our first of our landing pages or to the second page, if you will. Just a little bit about today's webinar. Please feel free to use social media or to tweet about today's discussion. You can see the MHDC tweet as well as Dr. Glaser's, excuse me, and you can see Dr. Glaser's organizational affiliation with Harvard Medical School. We have a couple of hashtags there, MHDC Glaser and Mass Health Data. And just a few rules of the road. We're muting everybody during the interview today because we want to have a smooth flowing conversation. We want to give folks the opportunity to listen. If you have questions, you can please type them into the chat box. We'll be collecting those questions during the course of today's discussion, and we'll be answering them at the question and answer period we set up at the end, which is a significant amount of time. So if you have questions, we'll get to them. Please type them into the chat box and we'll be answering those and others that pop to mind at the end of today's interview. We've set, like I said, about 30 minutes for that. We are recording the interview. If you don't wish to be recorded or don't wish to have anything you might say made available as part of the public record, you should probably leave our discussion today. Not that we don't welcome you, but we do interview our events, and we do record our events, and we'll be recording this one today. And lastly, please take a moment to complete our poll. It's brief at the end of today's meeting, so that we can continue to improve these events for you and other members of our community. Next page. Just very briefly about who is MHDC. Many of you know who we are, many of you may not. We've been in a collaboration of payers, providers, associations, not-for-profits, for-profits that span government, that span healthcare, originally in Massachusetts, but increasingly regionally and nationally. We're known as a convener. We're skilled at bringing people together and not taking sides. We bring health data standards and regulations expertise. We also pride ourselves on, as I mentioned, a local focus and a national influence. And lastly, we invent things. We test things. We like to build and try out everything from common exchanges between payers and providers to more complex and interesting applications such as real-time or e-prior authorization, which is one of the prototypes that we're developing. Last page, Lynn. What do we do? In addition to these kinds of events, which you can see along the bottom of your screen, which include the forum, which is a community event open to the community, but really focused on the needs of the chief information, chief technology, chief information security officers who have particular issues with which, that are at the top of their agendas. We will do over 40 webinars a year. So if you haven't attended our webinars, please keep an eye out for those. In terms of what we offer services, we offer data governance through our data governance collaborative. how do you standardize the data that we're all supposed to be standardizing, and how do you go about moving from the hodgepodge of the lack of connectivity, the lack of communication between payers, providers, and people, and move toward an interoperable health system. We have NEHN, and which, for those of you who are unaware of NEHN, the New England Health Exchange Health Exchange Network, which is a full EDI exchange network, as well as a testing bed for things like our prior authorization prototype. And lastly, we have the Spotlight Analytics toolset, where we bring clinical and business analytics to organizations who want to learn more based on the data that we have access to, as well as some of the analytics that we pride ourselves on doing. So thank you for allowing us that brief moment of that public service announcement, if you will. And now we're going to start having our interview. And let me just start by saying, John Glaser, welcome to the Vantage Point interview series. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Right. Thank you, Denny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Just by way of introduction, we want to start today by talking about your background. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of, who you are, where you came from, a little bit about, the story behind, your professional life?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a basic background here. I'm a fairly fortunate guy. I mean, I was born in this country at this time in history to parents who raised me well, passed on good genes, and made sure that I was, educated and didn't get into too much trouble or mayhem. And I had some really supportive and colleagues and people who taught me and helped me along the way. So I'm at the twilight of my career. I'm at the sort of that last nine, as they say. But it's been a remarkable run, Denny. I have a lot to be proud of, a lot to be pleased with.
Well, thank you for that. Your school years were as we were talking before returning, going live today. Your school years were eventful, to say the least. Share a little bit with us about those.
Yeah, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I went to grammar school, Catholic grammar school there. Went off to a British boarding school for my freshman year in high school. My father was a consultant in McKinsey, was stationed in Dusseldorf, Germany for a year. He sent my brother and I to British boarding school, and they worked you. I mean, I had in the 1 year there, essentially the equivalent of 4 years of U.S. high school education, and it was remarkable. I also still have a cricket bat in my attic for reasons that are not clear to me other than to club an intruder. But nonetheless, anyway, I came back from that and went to a all-male Catholic Jesuit high school in San Jose, California. And in the middle of my junior year, in February of my junior year, I was expelled from that school for having worked with 3 colleagues to write an underground newspaper. Now, the underground newspaper wasn't much of a newspaper, but we each wrote a column, which was about drinking beer and taking advantage of 16-year-old girls. And we had working knowledge of drinking beer. We had only fantasies and dreams about actually getting dates and stuff along those lines. But we made the mistake, Denny, of publishing this on the afternoon of parents' night. So mom and dad came down to meet with the Jesuits, and there was this stuff flying all over the place, and the roof blew off, And so the following morning, we were all in front of a tribunal of Jesuits, and one by each. And those of you who are older and Catholic might remember the mea culpa, which is the Latin for I'm sorry. But my 3 buddies who were before me apologized and expressed their dismay at what they'd done. I was the last one in, and I got into this room full of 9 Jesuits. And I was mad at them because they taught you to challenge political order and taught you to challenge, Catholic orthodoxy, et cetera. And here they were holding me up for doing what I thought was a good challenge. So they said, you wrote the damage done to the school and how this has countered everything we're trying to teach you as a fine, upstanding Catholic young man. And I said, I actually wasn't sorry at all. That as far as I was concerned, the Catholic Church was a criminal organization that for thousands of years had suppressed science, conducted unjust wars, and I thought the position on birth control is, dooming millions of women and children to an untimely death or, sort of limited, sort of stunted upbringing. And I said I was actually proud of what I'd done, and I hoped it would be the first in a long series of criminal activities on my part in keeping with the tradition of the Catholic Church. And that I was decapitated. I didn't realize how mad they were, and obviously misread the situation here. So anyway, there it was. February of my junior year, I was out of school. I did not want to go to another high school for senior year, so I went off to college. Very late applicant to Duke. I was 16. I was probably a little too young, frankly, a little too immature for that sort of college experience. I was a math major because I liked math, and probably an unremarkable set of years. I did spend the summers doing short order cooking, but I also did trail crew in the Pacific Northwest and taught wilderness skills in the Pacific Northwest. And it was there, perhaps the most momentous thing is I met my wife when she was a freshman and I was a junior. We were in the same dorm together. But anyway, there it was, British boarding school, getting booted out of high school. I still have a copy of that underground newspaper. It's pretty mild, but at the time certainly caused quite the ruckus. And then went through Duke and finished up with a degree in math and a spouse.
Well, one does learn from experiences like that the Inquisitions had their names because that's exactly what they did at the time. Yeah. It looks like you had one of your own. When you graduated from college, your life took a few interesting turns. What happened then? I mean, what did you do immediately upon finishing it too?
Well, in my last semester, I didn't know what to do with myself once I was going to graduate. I mean, all of my colleagues seemed so certain. They're going to go to medical school or business school or at a job and in a company doing this, that, or the other. And I didn't know. So I took every graduate school exam I could think of. It took the MCATs, the GREs, the GMATs, the LSATs, the actual exam, every exam I could think of. Because I figured I'll never be this smart again. This is it. I peaked, the tender age of 20. And these things are good for 5 years. So I got those. And my first job out of college was at Pizza Hut. And I remember Denny sending in while I was there to the Duke Alumni Magazine, where they sort of publish who's doing what, et cetera. And there's your colleagues who've got their first Nobel Prize and are running Fortune 500 companies. Excuse me. And I sent a missive that said, John P. Glaser's a chef at Pizza Hut making minimum wage. And they wouldn't publish it because the last thing they wanted was mom and dad to be reading this thing and say, I send my kid to this fancy school and they come out making minimum wage at a pizza place. But anyway, I went to Pizza Hut. I got finished with that or decided that was enough of that. And I went off to work in a salmon cannery in Alaska. My brother and I went up there and worked in Bumblebee Seafoods in South Naknek, Alaska. When that was done, I had, hold on a second. I had $6,000 in cash and nothing to do. So this is August of 1976, which will give you an indication of how old I am. But anyway, I hitchhiked from Fairbanks, Alaska to the Panama Canal. It took me 6 months, went through North Carolina on my way. And, it was a remarkable experience in a lot of ways. It was, I'd, never felt prejudice before. And here I was a gringo in Panama at the time when the tensions were very high with America. I'd never seen poverty like I saw in Central America. I'd never seen the sort of range of people that you get when you cross the country. So anyway, I got out of there and, hitchhiked my way to Panama. And it took me from, August to early winter of 1977.
So, it sounds like in some respects, the experience of just going hitchhiking to Panama, being introduced to the diversity and the poverty that you saw, that sounds like a fairly formative experience, I would think, after, going from, I don't know what I want to do to finding yourself in those kinds of circumstances.
Yeah, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. But I certainly had, being frankly, a somewhat sheltered upbringing as a middle-class white kid, hadn't seen certain things. And so I was, what I saw in, some of the rides I had is these remarkable people, and they were farmers and they were hairdressers, et cetera. And they gave me rides and they were really neat. They had some really neat observations about life. They were proud of their family. They had some interesting histories of what they had done. And so I'd never seen that. I'd never seen cultures that were different from mine, et cetera. So that, well, I guess the British would do that. So I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot that, it's okay to take prudent risks. I also learned a lot about hitchhiking, Denny. So to the degree you decide that you want to hitchhike long distance, I'll give you three pieces of rule here. One, you never hitchhike at night because the wacko element is higher at night. You never hitchhike within 25 miles of a big city because that's you're usually going to get a short ride, and you really want long rides. You want 300-mile rides rather than 20-mile rides, et cetera. And if you can, you hitchhike out of truck stops because you can walk up to a trucker or a car and introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm a Duke student heading back to see my girl. Can I get a ride from you? So I learned about all of that. It was I grew up a lot, learned a lot out there, although I still didn't know what to do with myself.
All right. So you returned from Panama. How do you find your way to healthcare and healthcare information technology?
Well, I got to Panama, so I'm done hitchhiking. This is enough. I mean, the 6 months on the road like that, the fun is over. I also realized, and I think I was a little slow on the uptake, that this woman I had met at Duke, I was madly in love with her. So whatever it was, I'm going to go back and be with her. And so I went back to North Carolina, took the first job that I was offered, which was as a Fortran programmer analyst at Research Triangle Institute, which at the time was doing a large study for the National Center for Health Services Research on healthcare costs and quality. So my job was to help analyze, the survey data that they were collecting here. And I thought, wow, healthcare is pretty darn cool. It's really complicated, and there's a lot of complexity here. It was just very, very interesting. So that was my exposure to healthcare, and an indirect way to the IT aspects. Although I was a technical person, more so than the eventual management person.
So you then go, I would think, to UNC or to Duke, but you go to Minnesota for graduate school. Can you tell us a little bit about why Minnesota and why a PhD? What sort of motivated you?
I realized, of course, that I liked Fortran programming, but I didn't really want to be a Fortran programmer for the rest of my life. So my stepmother suggested, well, why don't you get into the field of medical informatics? And I thought, well, that sounds interesting enough. And you probably need to go off to graduate school to do that. So at the time, there were 3 programs nationally that had medical informatics in the degree title. I mean, you could go someplace, get a computer science degree with a focus on medicine. But those 3 places were UCSF, Stanford, and the University of Minnesota. And I thought, well, I've grown up in the Bay Area. No point going back to that. I mean, nice place, but I might as well try a different part of the country. So I went up to the University of Minnesota to do that. And above beyond being different, it was also, I had a 4-year free ride from those folks to come on up and to do this. Now, the reason for a PhD were pretty darn thin. I thought, well, being called doctor would be kind of cool. What do I know? Now, it turns out it is cool, but it's not as cool as you might think. Those of you may say, boy, I'd always want to be that. But I thought, I will just go give this a fly. It was a flyer. It was not a reason I want to be an academic or I want to be a subject matter expert at a consulting firm. It was, probably the same sort of line of deep thinking that led to me to hitchhike from Fairbanks, Alaska to the Panama Canal.
I was going to say it seemed similarly well considered.
I know, exactly. I did not do the pro-con list and, read up about it and all that other stuff. I thought, so we got married and, took the dog up to Minnesota.
What was your research and dissertation topic? Tell us a little bit about your actual studies there.
Yeah. Well, I got there and I spent a lot of time at the business school and a lot of time in the School of Sociology because sort of my basic premise is the technology is complicated and the technology is difficult. I mean, it was then, it still is. But more complicated and more difficult was having the ability of an organization to absorb the technology and change how they work and actually become better as a result. And I thought, well, that's a much more complicated problem. So I'm going to go off and focus on the softer side of the field that we have here. So my actual dissertation was in organization theory, as an organization theorist, and basically looking at how when you implement these systems, the electronic health record, et cetera, how do you affect the process of coordination, which is one of the sort of fundamental processes in healthcare is the coordination of tasks, across care venues or within a hospital, et cetera. So I did that. And, the basic conclusion was it matters more how you implement than what you implement. I mean, obviously there's within reason. So that was where I focused. Then it was on that particular. So, and I wrote a 467-page dissertation. This thing was a monster. And I sometimes will get in various talks, students will say, geez, I'm thinking of getting a PhD. You got a PhD. What's it like to get a PhD? So, well, here, look, there's two ways to do it. One is you can be really smart. That wasn't me. And best I can tell, that isn't you either. The second is you can write this monster dissertation like I wrote, this 467-page dissertation. So here's what you do. You sit down and you just start writing. You type and you type until your wrists are screaming. You're going for raw volume. Punctuation's good if you can get it, but not critical. And throw in about 20 graphs, meaningless graphs and tables, good things going up, bad things going down. Add about 100 references, field and stream, boy's life, car and driver, that kind of stuff here. And you turn it into your committee. And they look at this thing sitting on their desk. Shoot, it's 4 feet tall. They've never seen anything this large, but they have to read it. So they're going to read it. And you're going to go back about a month later and say, what'd you think? What'd you think? And you're all eager looking for their feedback. And they say it needs some work. And so basically that means it sucked. And so you spend the next 6 months relaxing. You golf, you go on a vacation, you watch cartoons, whatever it is. And at the end of that, you add about another 20 meaningless pages, 5 more meaningless graphs, 10 more meaningless references, and you turn it back into them. And they say, did you make the changes I suggested? And you say, yes, I did. I'm all over. They're not going to read it again. So you go just outlast them with volume, et cetera. And I remember, Denny, this is, golly, it was 10 years after I graduated. I went back to the University of Minnesota, and they were dedicating a new library in the School of Public Health, which is where my department was located. And there was this beautiful mahogany cabinet with chrome and lights, et cetera, with various pieces of memorabilia from the informatics program, which was 30 years old, and lots of photos and this, that, and the other. In the middle of this case was my dissertation with a little light shining on it. And it was the only dissertation in the case. And I asked my advisor, Lil Gatewood, why was this here? It wasn't very good. She said, I know it wasn't very good, but it's still the longest dissertation in the history of programming. I thought, yes, I still hold the world record for dissertation length. But anyway, that's what I did. I spent 4 years in sociology and management, writing about care coordination, producing this moose of a dissertation.
So you complete your graduate work and you move to Boston. And this is where your career as we know it and as we understand it starts to form. Can you tell us a bit about your arrival in Boston and what you did?
Yeah, I was drawn here I had a job offer at Arthur D. Little to run their healthcare IT consulting practice. So I came out to do that. And Arthur D. Little is a remarkable company. They're no longer with us, but they did some very sophisticated, generally technology-centric consulting. So I did that for 3 years, and that was really neat. I really liked it. But at towards the end of it, my wife said, listen, we have 2 little kids. We both like to have a third, but you got to get off the road. You being gone Monday through Friday, that's just not a good idea, raising a young family. And she was absolutely right. So I left Arthur D. Little and became the chief information officer at Brigham and Women's Hospital. So that was in early '88. And I enjoyed growing experience in a big way to do the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And we did some neat stuff. We moved this, there's a lot of internal development at the Brigham, and we moved all of the applications to this very large network of distributed personal computers, 386 class machines, if you will, remember that lineage, and ran this on a highly, big client server architecture, which is really quite the technology bold move. We also, at the time, there were some studies looking at medication errors across the Harvard teaching hospitals and found that they were really quite high. And here you have all Galaxy doctors and nurses, but geez, the number of medication errors was scary. So we said, well, how about if we do, provider order entry, which was really uncommon at the time. And basically centering on what I thought was the most critical process in healthcare, which is the process by which a doctor decides what to do. Here's the drugs you should take, here's the surgery you need. They make a decision, and that drives quality, and that drives costs, et cetera. So we thought, well, we'll intercept that decision in the order and critique it. And if you think, the med error is going to, be significant enough, we'll challenge you on that. So we did CPOE and did a lot of, work on provider order entry, et cetera. So that was neat. And along the way, Denny, and it's been throughout my career, began to become involved locally and nationally in the field. So remember working with MHDC and helping to set up the CIO forum, and then working
Right.
with some regional collaborators, other CIOs to set up the New England Healthcare NEHAN, helping to set that up. So sort of saying broadly, we have to, a lot we have to do in this field. Let's work together to make certain things happen. But also as national, I was, the chairman of the board of HIMSS, back in 1990, and then the founding chairman of CHIME, the Healthcare CIO, National Healthcare CIO Group, and then the chairman of the board of the eHealth Initiative, which does a lot of policy work, et cetera. So anyway, I became quite involved, not only at Brigham and then partners, but also within national and local organizations. In 95, as a result of the Brigham and the Mass General coming together, I became the CIO of Partners. And there the task was to integrate 11 IT groups, which were spread across the various partners entities, but also to bring in, common infrastructure like email and networks, et cetera, and to bring in the sort of common, financial systems, particularly in the general accounting arena. I think Partners wanted to be an integrated delivery system. That was its aspiration, but it wasn't far enough along in there to really lay the political and financial groundwork for having a common EHR or common, patient accounting system. I mean, later that it would become, more reasonable. But at the time, it was doing like an EMPI or clinical data repository to help bring it together. But anyway, and at the same time, above and beyond laying the IT foundation for Partners, we set up the partners-wide telemedicine program with Joe Kvedar, and then got some funding from the National Institutes of Health to set up a National Center for Biomedical Computing, led by Zach Kohani and Suzanne Churchill. So we did some neat, innovative stuff along the way. But that was a 22-year period of time, between 7 at the Brigham and 15 at Partners, laying the IT foundation for them.
So you've spent a significant portion of your career really at the before, during, and after the experiment with IDNs, putting together these integrated delivery networks. And then you went to Siemens. Tell us about what the work you did with Siemens and subsequently Cerner, if you would.
Yeah, it was, in 2008, I was getting restless. It occurred to me I was about ready to do my 21st IT budget, for Partners / the Brigham. And I said, I know how to do the budget. I'm pretty good at doing this budget, et cetera. But, this is becoming too automatic. I was restless. So I told my boss, who was the chief operating officer of Partners, I'm restless. And he said, well, go take a sabbatical. And I said, to do what? He said, I don't really care. Just get this restlessness out of your system. So I knew at that time that the high-tech legislation had passed and that there were still regulations to be written to say, well, what does meaningful use really mean? What would you see when you saw it? And I knew that David Blumenthal was going to become the new national coordinator. And I know David from the Mass General and the Brigham. So I said to David, hey, if I came down and spent some time with you all helping to write the rules and put together the program to spend $37 billion and help HIE development and this, that, and the other, would that be of interest to you? So I took a leave, and in 2009 through early 2010, was actually a Fed. We worked at ONC and HHS to help write the rules and put in place the meaningful use program. So I came back from that. It was the sort of late winter, early spring of 2010, and the restlessness was now worked because it was such an exciting time down there. It was just really neat to be in the middle of all this stuff. And about 2 weeks after I got back, I got a call from Tom Miller, who was with Siemens, who said, the head of our HIT business has quit. Would you like the job to be the CEO of our health services, which is their HIT business? And it took me about 48 hours to talk to my spouse and think about stuff. And I said, sure. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? I can get fired. And that's pretty low in the scheme of things in terms of life travesties, et cetera. So I wound up at Siemens and helped them grow their HIT business, and both domestically, but also internationally, and learned a lot about that. But it was also clear to me, Denny, that they, their hearts and minds were elsewhere. They were in the imaging business and in the lab business, et cetera, and really weren't inclined to make the types of investments I thought they had to make in the HIT business to help it grow. So at the end of about 4 years, he said, listen, the right thing to do is to sell this asset, take the money and invest it where you really want to invest it. So we were sold to Cerner, and I went to work at Cerner for 5 years and was running their population health business, but also help integrate the Siemens test staff and customer base into the Cerner base and help them think through, a variety of strategies. What do you do post meaningful use to grow? What's the next growth horizon? What's the EHR adoption levels up? So anyway, I spent the between the two, 5 years at Siemens, 5 years at Cerner, and in the end of 2019, retired from Cerner, and then sort of closed the book on full-time employment.
So now we find you back in Boston. We find you moving around, I should say, doing a number of things in a number of different places. But you're now working. You're now with the Harvard Medical School. Talk about what you're doing there and the kind of work that you're enjoying at this stage.
Well, I have probably a sort of portfolio of stuff to do. It's probably pretty typical of people like me who quote retire. It's probably a lowercase r. That's going to go in here, and I never really developed an affinity or love of golf or yachting or whatever. So once I get to retirement,
Likewise, right.
Yeah, what am I going to do? And not drive my spouse up the wall or myself up the wall on all this stuff here. So I wound up with a classic portfolio. So I all along the way, beginning when I wound up down at Siemens, I teach a course in e-health to the Wharton MBAs and have done that for 11 years. Our 12th year will be, next spring. And so I teach that. It's a riot. They're all very young, very accomplished, et cetera. And the only thing they lack is real scar tissue because they just have, you're 25, you haven't had it yet. You'll get it, but you haven't had it yet. And also last year started to teach executive ed at the Harvard Medical School. And 4 times a year, teach a course on leading digital transformation in healthcare. And so we get, 2-week course, and we get students from all over the planet across all sectors and help them think through what does it mean? What's involved in digital transformation? And, one of the things, Denny, is you look at digital transformations across industries. And, we all know the Netflix and the Amazons and this, that, and the other, but 70% of them fail. And they fail in what way? Well, they fail because they take too long, a lot longer than they thought. They cost a lot more than people thought, and the results are more disappointing than they had hoped. So it crossed the finish line, but it failed. But so we teach them how to avoid that. Nobody wants to be in the 70%. So I do that teaching. I also write. I've written lots of articles over the years, currently working on 2 books with 2 colleagues from Medical University of South Carolina. We've written a textbook for C-suite in healthcare. And we just turned our 5th edition into the publisher. You do an edition about every 4 years. And so that's, we'll see what the publisher says. And then working with a colleague or 2 colleagues, one, Tom Davenport, who's a colleague at MIT and Babson, and the other Elizabeth Gardner, who is a reporter and writer out of Chicago, on a book on AI in healthcare, and particularly for the board. If you're the board, what do you have to know about all this stuff? So that's probably mid-flight that we're doing that. So anyway, there's the teaching, and then there's the writing stuff. And then sit on some boards, NCQA, the American Telemedicine Association, a couple of startups, some startups started by former Wharton students of mine, but do some board work. And then last but not least, Danny, I'm a grandfather. So 4 munchkins, ranging from 2.5 down to 3 months, and a 5th munchkin, on the way in late October. So I've, begun to sort of teach them, as grandfathers are supposed to do. For example, with Miss Emma, who's 2.5. Last week I told her that I actually had 2 belly buttons. One where she knows where it is right on the front, but she said, well, what about the other? I said, I can't show it. So she's just all excited that, she's told all her classmates in daycare that her grandfather has 2 belly buttons. So anyway, you got to pass on the wisdom to those kids, but that's what I'm up to.
All right. Thank you for that, John. That was a great introduction. And as some of you on the call know, the Vantage Point interview series is about learning and knowing about the people we admire and work with. So we're going to move on to the second stage of our interview today. We're going to talk about, sort of, John, you've written articles, 2 of which I've read recently in the Harvard Business Review and other publications, looking at, invention and innovation, looking at the evolution of the finance industry and the parallels that can be drawn with healthcare as we go through the kind of evolution we're going through now. But one of the things that we are seeing, and that I would be really interested in your perspectives on, is, health data and health information technologies we're evolving. And it's painful. It's a painful evolution for the industry right now because in many respects, we're evolving from being an enterprise-centric technology stack, if you will, to one that is centered at the patient level. And billions, tens, if not hundreds of billions were spent laying the groundwork for electronic medical records. But we're going through this tumultuous time where we're likely to run into some, as exciting as it is, some unintended consequences and some bumps along the road. You know, as a highly practiced and highly regarded operator, practitioner, as an academic, as a strategist, what would you ask us as a community? If we step back and look at this upheaval that we're going through in terms of interoperability, information blocking, no surprises, the list is long. What are some of your thoughts about navigating and what are you telling the boards and others that with whom you work about working through a time as tumultuous as this?
Well, Danny, I think, a couple of things, and these are sort of ways of sort of framing and understanding the challenge that confronts us all here. One is that a lot of the systems we put in place are enterprise systems, and there will always be major investments in enterprise systems because enterprises buy them. And they buy EHRs, they buy patient accounting, and they say, I needed to do certain things. And so there we go. This is what it has to do for me to do the kinds of things I want to do. Increasingly, the enterprise is turning to the individual. I have to do a better job of clinically managing someone because there's value-based care, but I may have to incorporate social determinants because that obviously is pretty critical in terms of your health, et cetera. And I also want to make sure that I'm attractive to you as a patient. So the sort of digital front door. So above and beyond technologies which are direct to consumer, such as some digital therapeutics of anxiety and depression, but also you can get drugs for erectile dysfunction or hair loss or whatever. We see the enterprise increasingly turning to patients. So you're right, we're in the middle of this shift that is going on that other industries have seen. And that will be hard and challenging for us in many ways here too. Excuse me, sorry about this. The other thing that I think we have to realize that the second is one of the things you learned, Danny, when you look at digital transformations in other industries, is they never stop. It's not like you get to a point that we are transformed. It gets no better than this. We are at the peak of performance. It always goes on. Digital transformation is a never-ending thing. If nothing else, if technology changes, the circumstances change, the business environment changes, the business models that are relevant change, et cetera. So these things go on forever. So let's settle in. It's going to go on forever. And the third, related to that, it takes very long periods of time to go through this stuff. So one of the things I thought was interesting is if you look at last year, in the height of the pandemic, what percent of retail revenue in the United States was done through e-commerce versus the store? Now, remember, this is the height of the pandemic where people are afraid, to go to stores and go to, supermarkets, et cetera. And the answer is 18%. It's 18%. You got to be kidding me. That seems low. I said, well, part of it is because, people don't buy gas, over the internet. But the point is, and you say, well, when was Amazon founded? The answer is 1994. And you say, so in 27 years, we've got from 0 to 18%. Now, it's uneven. That's unfair because certain parts of the industry have been clobbered, electronics, books, et cetera, but other parts have not. Grocery has not been clobbered. Fine jewelry not been clobbered, et cetera. So the point is, even in retail, it takes time to go through this. And it will take time. So it will take us, first, it never ends. Second, it takes long periods of time to go off and do this. The next piece is that, healthcare is arguably the most complex industry that exists. Complex knowledge domain. When I was in graduate school studying, as an organization theorist, hospitals are the most studied organizational form by organization theorists because they can't figure out how they work. They're too complicated to work. And sometimes we think they barely work, based on our interactions with them. But it's got a complex knowledge domain. It's a complex social economic good. It's got all these various actors, et cetera. So it's hard to change very complex systems quickly. And even when you change them, the change will be imperfect. So you say, listen, the path will get better, but it's going to be this sort of lurching. This worked and that worked, pros, ebbs and flows, or this, that, or the other. And wherever we are, there'll be more to be done, but we'll look at it and say, this is an imperfect thing that we have done, et cetera. So we ought to just settle in there. And I think the last point is we have to be very thoughtful. Sometimes we throw around slogans in this industry which don't serve us well because they sort of apply some magic properties or some reality that doesn't really exist. So I'll give you two examples. One of which is platforms. So we throw the word platforms around as if platforms per se have virtue, and sometimes they do. Facebook is a platform, Amazon is a platform, iOS is a platform, but it's not always the right answer. An app, like an EHR, although EHRs are becoming more platform-like with fire centers, et cetera, are actually better way to solve certain things than platforms. So anyway, we give certain things to sort of magic properties or truisms of value, when in fact it's a little more complicated than that. And the last point, Denny, is we sometimes, you mentioned the banking order. We sometimes point to banking and say, well, they're all interoperable. What's wrong with us? We're so behind the times. We must be really screwed up, et cetera. And you say, yes, banking is further along. So is travel. But frankly, they're the only two industries that are much further along than us. So it's not like we're one of the last, to cross the finish line. We're right in the middle, frankly, in terms of interoperability. But even with banking, yes, you can go to an ATM and get cash. I get that. And similarly, at the end of the day, when you deposit your check from Wells Fargo into a Bank of America, those two settle up at the end of the day. There's an interoperability that occurs behind the scenes. So banking does have interoperability. On the other hand, if you go to an ATM and say, I want 20 bucks, and your Bank of America account says, you don't have it, you got 10 bucks. But what it doesn't do is say, tell you what, I'm going to ask all other banks if you have an account there. And if you do, I'm going to take 10 bucks from them and move it in here and serve up the 20 bucks. That doesn't happen. And similarly, when we do it's sort of our use cases, query, what else does anybody know about John Glaser, sort of polls, record locatory service stuff? That analog does not occur in banking, et cetera. Why? Because the banks don't want it to occur. They don't want you in there poaching their high value, high deposit customers, et cetera. So even banking or travel has more interoperability, but it's very targeted, where there's a clear business case that all participants agree, and where there's an entity that helps coordinate their activities, but it's always incomplete. So anyway, Dan, I think we have this transition. It's a hard transition. It will take, it never ends. It goes on forever. It'll be bumpy, et cetera. But nonetheless, the stakes are high. So at the end of the day, if your efforts and my efforts and everybody on this phone call's efforts mean that patients are better cared for and docs or nurses are better able to do their job, then we'll have done all we can do to help that move along.
Thank you. That's very helpful, John. We get enamored of the latest shiny objects. So it's good to know that sometimes they're just shiny objects, and they're not necessarily the answers to what we think, nor are we necessarily in the last of revolutions to occur in this industry. One of the things that you and I talked about in preparing for this interview, I was going to ask you questions throughout our conversation as to, what did you learn in terms of your leadership philosophy from your experience A, your experience B, but as we got to talking further about this conversation, you shared with me a commemorative you wrote when Dick Nesson, who was the CEO of Partners Healthcare at the time, when Dick Nesson was retiring, and that pretty much summarized, and I think eloquently so, your leadership philosophy. And I asked you, and you agreed to read that commemorative letter or that commemorative piece. Would you do that for us if you have
Sure.
that with you?
I do have it with me. So just as a bit of a backdrop, I write a letter to my family every week and have done so for 35 years. And it's usually 3 to 4 pages, and it covers, a range of topics. Sometimes it covers, family, what's going on with the kids, and sometimes it covers me and sort of a career and what I'm thinking about, and sometimes it just covers topics of interest. So, for example, in this week's letter, writing about, was driving along Cape Cod, there's a sign for the Space Force. And I said, son of a gun, we have Space Force on Cape Cod. What do they do? Well, it turns out they track objects. They track satellites and debris, et cetera. And there's thousands of objects. And I thought, well, how in the world do they track that sometimes are no larger than a softball. Anyway, so I wrote about that. And anyway, there's about 22 people who get it, and I like writing it, and I think they by and large like reading it. So excuse me, in 1997, I wrote part of my letter was written about the retirement of Dick Nesset. And let me read to you what I wrote at that point. On Friday night, I attended a retirement party for Dick Women's Hospital and CEO of Partners Healthcare System. It was an emotional evening for him, his family, and the 300 plus people in the audience, and for me. His accomplishments are remarkable. He was a co-founder of the Harvard Community Health Plan. He saved the Brigham from disaster in the early 1980s and built it into one of the greatest academic medical centers in the world. He was a co-founder of Partners, which is regarded as a bold, visionary move. But there's much more than that being acknowledged that evening. I and most of the rest of the people of that group, and I'm sure lots of people who were not there, are different, better people because of what we learned from Dick. I learned that caring for the people who work with you and for you matters. It matters because they are people, and that's what people do. They care for each other. It also matters because it builds incredible loyalty. Loyalty that keeps talent, deters their leaving for other opportunities. Loyalty which causes them to want to give more of themselves to pursue the goals and the work that needs to get done. I learned that caring is not a set of actions, although these happen, but rather it is an attitude, an orientation, a principle that guides action. I learned about the meaning behind the words patient care. I learned that it is the bedrock, has to be the bedrock behind all that we do in this field. I learned that it is more than making the physician the best that they can be. It is also making the nurse, social work, farmers, pharmacists, and all the other participants as good as they can be. It means reaching out to those who are poor. It means remembering that the patient is a human being, not a broken mechanical system. It also means that the preservation of the patient's dignity should govern all that we do. I learned about taking enormous risk. I learned that we are in a position to take those, and that at times we must take those if we are to lead. I learned about managing risks. I learned about supporting, helping those who are in the middle of the risky venture and standing by them, running interference for them when the inevitable turbulence sets in. I learned how to manage very talented people, point them in a broad direction, support them, resources, political help, picking them up when they stumble. I learned to cherish talent and nurture it. I learned that to let them grab center stage when it all goes well. I learned to step in and take the crap for them when things aren't going well. I learned what it means to be tough, and that it isn't about growling or clobbering people. It's about conviction, about being persistent, stubborn, about making hard decisions and sticking with them. It is very much about having core values and principles that guide everything. It means never acting in a way that is not consistent with those values. I knew about, but learned more, the treasure that is created by a deep love and commitment to one's family. And to the degree that I lead or am a good leader, I learned that from him. It is all of the above rolled into a complicated mixture of skills, talents, emotions, beliefs, and experiences that every day guide what you say and do. I learned that leading happens every time you say something, do something, are present, or don't say something, don't do something, or are absent. Leadership is no single thing, no single attribute, no single skill. It is the accumulation of everything that you are and your actions. And within that, it is nobility and constancy of purpose and strength. I will miss Dick, miss him a lot. He will still spend a couple of days a week at Partners, and I doubt he will leave the field while he is alive. So I will still see and work with him, but perhaps I won't be able to miss him. I have been molded, changed by him significantly over the last 9 years. I bear his imprint and always will. He has made sure, to the degree that I was capable, that much of what he is, I have become. Every time I speak or act, I will feel his presence. And that's what I wrote, Denny. And I wrote that, and I put, above and beyond sending it out to the letter to the 22 who get these missives, I left a copy of this on his desk. And he came into my office the following morning, closed the door, and said, "You made my wife cry." And I think that also meant, which it may have, but also think it made him cry, because he was just of the generation where you just didn't say that. You were a little more guarded in your emotions. So it clearly impacted him. And then the other thing that got me is within a year, he was dead. He died of a heart attack. And I always thought that since then is if there's someone in your life who really matters, um, that you should tell them that, because there is one is they will delight obviously in hearing it, but also you never know when the time runs out. That you don't want to be at the time where you miss the opportunity to say something. But anyway, that's what I wrote, and that's it's just sort of changed me ever since.
Well, thank you, John. It's rare that when we get the kind of mentor that Dick Nesson obviously was for you, and the kind of influence that individual, as well as many other individuals, can have
Yeah.
on our career and lives. We're going to move into the Q&A part of our conversation. We're just about to hit the top of the hour, so we've been making good progress here. And I'm going to ask Janice Karen. Janice, if you would begin to provide the questions that have been collected during the course of today's conversation and present those to John.
Sure. So the first question, in many cases, the tech is the easy part. Aligning process and people is a lot harder. As someone who's done research in this area, can you talk more about the importance of considering process and workflow and not just technology when looking to implement health IT projects, and maybe give a few key pointers to folks who haven't focused on the non-technical pieces before?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's a fair observation. And I think the thing we collectively understand is that, technology in and of itself has no ROI. It's the technology and applied in the context of what you're trying to do that it can have an ROI. So the technology needs to be, brought in. People need to be trained. People need to have whatever workflow changes need to occur. I mean, when you actually look at, go back to the digital transformation, the remarkable transformations that have occurred, it's largely when you say, what was behind them? It's largely when they changed the business model. They changed what they did and how they did it in a very material way. So Netflix changed the business model for getting video. And Amazon changed the business model for retail, et cetera. And Expedia changed the business model for ordering flights, et cetera. So that's when you really want technology to accomplish what we intend to accomplish, is because you take the surrounding set of the ecosystem, processes, people, skills, et cetera, sometimes even the legal infrastructure, regulatory infrastructure, and you change them such that it all lines up. If you look at how did the automobile happen to have such an impact on our societies? Well, it certainly was the car, the technology, but also meant roads and driving conventions and insurance and gas stations and all kinds of things that had to surround it for it to truly achieve what we'd like it to achieve. So, and the last thing I'll point out here is, one of the things that a class, which I suspect you all know, is a thing called the Arch Collaborative, where they bring together health systems to explore issues with the electronic health record. One of the things they found is that you can take users of Epic and Cerner and find organizations that are very happy. You pull the docs, to what degree does the EHR really help you improve the care that you deliver? And 80% would say high five on this stuff. And you go to other organizations and you'll get only 20%, where it's essentially people, want to throw it out the window. And you say, wait a minute, it's the same technology. It's the same Epic system. It's the same Cerner system. Why is there such a radically different receptivity to this? And it turns out it has to do with to what degree training was good, to what degree personalization was done well, to what degree the clinicians were part of the decision process that led to it, so they feel like they participants rather than victims, and to what degree workflow changes were made. So, you see in those kinds of data real examples of where those kinds of changes really made the difference, whether it's in digital transformation or class results, between whether technology is viewed as a boat anchor or whether it's viewed as something that really helps advance.
Great, thank you. Next is kind of a similar question on organizational stuff. Can you talk a bit more about the challenges in combining multiple organizations with their own separate practices, culture, and vision?
Yes. I mean, I remember the various times of bringing 11 organizations, and we'd have meetings to quote get to know you, and one team would line up on one side of the table, the other team would line up at the other side of the table, staring at each other, and they're all worried. I mean, they're all worried that their jobs are titles will get changed, their pay may get changed, their bosses will get changed, they'll be asked to master tasks that they don't understand, and so they'll feel incompetent. So I think the major thing that you do is have a lot of discussions with them. about what we're trying to do and why. And you do a very good job of, when you have leadership structures, of having someone from, it's very like the Noah's Ark. You make sure that it's not all from what leadership teams, not all from one organization, it's from multiple organizations. You have lots of opportunities for those guys to get together and to interact, and you realize it's going to take time. And you also respect the organization, the culture that they come from. They're proud of what they had done, and they should be proud. And they have certain things that they believe are the right way to do things, and those things have served them well. So you have to be respectful of the way that they've done things. So I think it's complicated exercise of making sure that there's the building the relationship. You help the relationships to get built. You remove certain fears, fears of losing your job, or having to move your office, or whatever it is that's got to go on, and you show respect along the way for those organizations that have come together. And it'll take a long time, frankly, for those. And you'll always see in lots of ways, even years later, the outlines of the prior organization and the new integrated. This, you can't expect them to sort of abandon an identity totally. And in some ways, you don't want that to happen.
Great, thank you. So the next question, we're going to change focus now. What do you think ONC should focus on given their abilities, resources, and constraints?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, what they can focus on is sort of bound by the law, and bound. So what they have, quote, the statutory authority to focus on. So anyway, if it's not in the law, then they're not legally, can't do a variety of things. But anyway, where they're sort of statutorily focused is on, advancing interoperability. And I think they're doing a lot of work. I know Mickey was on this session a couple of weeks ago, and I know talking about how to use the technology and interoperability to advance the reduction of diversity of the healthcare experiences, and to continue to improve the quality and safety of care. So a lot of focus there. And I think above and beyond the standards, it is continue to work with their colleagues in other branches of government, CMS, et cetera, to advance the movement of value-based care. So there's just increased emphasis on care coordination, and there's just increased emphasis on managing people over time, and increased emphasis on delivering high quality care, and that's the way that you're going to get paid. So, one of the reasons I always thought, standards can enable interoperability, but it doesn't mean they'll occur. It'll occur when people are motivated for it to occur. And so you have to have the incentive system in place. The other thing that they can do, regardless of statutory authority, they have a phenomenal bully pulpit. So when Mickey gets out there and gives a talk, people listen to him. So he's got the ability to spread the message on a wide variety of stuff, whether it's engaging consumers, and whether it is, making sure we leverage the EHR to accomplish all that we'd like to accomplish. So I think, in a long-winded way of responding to your question, I think there's a bully pulpit role that they can play, with no necessarily authority to cause this to happen, and obviously a fair amount of interoperability work that they can still do, and also know that they're worried about and working on workforce-related issues. But anyway, that's what I think they're good. A lot of the agenda that is a sort of IT-specific agenda is also now wound up in the hands of CMS and also in the FDA, as the FDA considers what to do about artificial intelligence.
Right. Actually, I was going to do our other government-related question, but since you mentioned AI, let me give you the AI question.
Okay.
You mentioned that you're working on a book on AI in healthcare. If you had to give a healthcare executive 2 pieces of advice about AI, what would they be?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is, by and large, AI is part of something else. It makes something else perform better. It makes your car safer. It makes the imaging modality more effective at arriving at a conclusion, or it makes the process of utilization management more effective. So when you don't really examine AI per se, you examine a solution with AI capabilities. And your question is, does the AI capabilities really add to the ability of the solution to solve stuff? And there you can have not necessarily an AI conversation, but a conversation about, the solution, whether it's better. So one is, you don't buy AI, you buy a solution or a service that's more effective because of AI. And then you ask the questions you would ask about any solution or service that's got to go on. The second thing that I would point out is that obviously we're at the, if you look at the Gartner hype curve, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, we are at the, depends where on AI spectrum you are, we're at the peak of inflated expectations of the trough of disillusionment. We are not at the plateau of productivity. So be prepared for this bumpy ride. People are either be giddy about it, or in, the depths of despair about bias and other things that are going to go on here, et cetera. So it is it is, it's going to make it harder to sort of tease apart the reality of this. And that doesn't preclude you experimenting with stuff. It just means that it's going to be a little bit harder to go off and to do. The third thing I would point out is that, AI has a lot of the same risks that any technology has. You got to fit it into the workflow. You got to get people motivated to use it, et cetera. But there is algorithm risk, and there is algorithm risk of bias. There's algorithm risk of drift. There's algorithm risk of explainability. And so one of the things you have to do if you're a board person is make sure you understand the risk and make sure you understand the things that you're going to do to help manage that risk and to sort of mitigate it. What are you going to do, or what's your vendor going to do to mitigate risk of bias, et cetera? So I think there is for a lot of senior board people who've been around for a while, I said, look, it's the same way in a conversation that surrounded when the internet made its debut. Everybody would say, oh my goodness gracious, a lot of expectations, a lot of disillusionment. What's it going to do for us? And I think the sort of thoughtful examination of this thing is really smart and really quite capable of doing it. So anyway, that's what I would tell them to go off and to do, is to, in some ways, apply the instincts that you applied last time you saw this sort of major technology wave arrive.
Great. A follow-up on that. Do you think that people talk, this is for me, do you think that people talk about AI in the right way, or understand that it's a probabilistic system? And how do you help people understand that aspect of it, that it's not spitting out an answer, but a probability or likelihood of something?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. To your point, is part of it, helping people understand that it may not tell you it may not be right on the nose for a specific individual. It just means that in general, people like this have had the following, which doesn't mean per se that the person in front of you is going to get this. So I think that's true of any type of predictive algorithm. It's the same with, good regression. You'll have an R squared that isn't 100 or 1. It is something less than 1, which means that, there will be times when the regression model doesn't point out the specific case that's got to go on here. So I think that is the, helping people to understand, first of all, how these things got to be to the degree that you can. But the point is that it is guidance along the way and may not tell you exactly what to do in this particular situation. And there you go. But it certainly might be better than operating in the dark.
Okay, fair enough. So let me actually go back to that other sort of question in the government realm. Do you feel that meaningful use achieved what it was expected to achieve to this point?
Yeah, I think, there's, the answer is yes. If you say what it was meaningful use intended to do, which is to get broad adoption of the electronic health record, it certainly did that. So if you look at adoption by hospitals or physician practices, and there were groups that were missed out. I didn't get the funding. It's, and we've all seen the data going from 10% to 80%, 90%. It certainly accomplished that. And the way that the law was written was that there was not a lot of time to do this. You had to move pretty fast. So I think there was remember, this was part of the American Recovery Reinvestment Act, which was at the time, the economy was in the tank. And so there's a lot of effort to get money into the system to get people back to work, shovel-ready projects, all that other stuff. So there was an urgency here that had to go on. So the law said, put this money in there and move fast to go off and to do that. And it certainly got it done. Now, there's clearly, what I call hangover, things that were left behind. One is interoperability never got the traction that I think was being envisioned when the high-tech legislation was passed. The second is obviously we've created usability issues where people say, golly, this stuff's really a pain in the ass, too many clicks, et cetera. And the third, I think a lot of people, organizations said, you sort of check the box, compliant. I'm going to install it. That's the word, install. But I'm not really going to spend the time changing my practices. So we never really, in a lot of cases, didn't get the yield out of applying this tool. That prior comment about people and processes, that was really never done. So I checked the box. I'm going to get my check and avoid the penalties later on. So I think it did what it was core intended to do. It clearly left some work to be done as a result of the sort of haste to do this, and perhaps some naivete at times about what was really capable of being done under the high-tech or meaningfully used program.
Great, thank you. So here's the next question. As we move to consumer medicine and patients truly owning their patient record and being advocates or responsible for their own health, do you think new scenarios will emerge to improve interoperability? And if so, what will they be?
Well, I think a couple things, and I'm not sure, how this will, play this. I think a couple of questions. One is, I think legally, the concept is nobody really owns the medical record, not even the patient. What you have is differential rights and responsibilities across all the participants. So, if you go into an emergency room and the docs suspect you of, abusing a kid or abusing your spouse, they have to report that to the state. You can't stop them. You don't own that. Similarly, if you don't like what the doc wrote in the note, you can't change that. You can ask for an addendum, but you can't change it. So each of the parties has sort of different rights and responsibilities. So the notion of ownership doesn't really quite work on this thing. That being said, I say we're going to potentially have a more active consumer patient, and they'll put pressure on the industry to integrate. They'll put pressure on the healthcare system to do a better job of delivering care, and they'll put pressure on costs, et cetera. So I think that's partially or probably true. What I think is hard is not all patients are capable of that or actually care to do all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a big thing to battle, et cetera. So, sometimes people don't have the means or the time to go off and do this, but sometimes they do. So what I don't really know is if you imagine the sort of pitchforks outside the castle walls, the people hue and cry, we got to change, is how big will that crowd be, over the course of time. So I don't really know how that, particularly will play out here, et cetera. So I think there are limits. I also think it's hard for a consumer at times to do this. I remember I certainly, I see my doc. I get to go into my portal to see my test results. I have no idea what some of these test results mean. I understand flags, but I don't really know what a creatinine clearance does. Not really. So there's a real knowledge gap, an experience gap between me and my doctor, and I'm not going to take the time to read about creatinine clearance. So the point is, there's a lot of trust that I place in the healthcare system. It's a little different than buying a retail transaction. So I think we'll get more active patients. I just don't know how active it will be. And I don't know how much pressure they will put on the healthcare system. I mean, employers will, regulators will, et cetera, but I just don't know how active they will be. So that we'll see. I mean, I do think, at the end of the day, there's sort of two, in my belief, two categories of interaction with a patient in the healthcare system. One is what I think is very transactional. I want to get a vaccine. Shoot, I don't care if I know who you are, who registers me, or who, sticks the needle in my arm. Just give me the darn vaccine, et cetera. Very transactional. And you see a lot of the CVS and the Walgreens and the Walmarts doing very transactional care, et cetera. Great. I just want to know the price. I want to know that you can do it. And I want to know that it's reasonable quality. I trust that it is. And there's another category of care, which I think is more agency, which says, man, oh man, this is complicated territory and the stakes are much higher. I have cancer, or I have dementia, or whatever. And here, this is not a transactional thing like this. I trust you to help me work my way through this very complicated, perhaps emotionally laden situation. And in a way, it's like, I have a financial planner. Some of you may too. I don't really know what he's talking about when he says we ought to invest here, there. I'm thinking, oh, for God's sakes, I don't understand all this crap. But I trust him that it's very complicated and he's got my best interests at heart. Or similarly, if I had a complex legal matter, I don't really know the law. So there are classes of interaction which are very complicated. The stakes are very high, and which there's clearly a knowledge disparity here. And so we will trust folks to go off and to do those things. I think the latter is there's some interoperability, but that's not at the core of this. The former has got some interoperability, but it depends on to what degree I think it's essential for me to get the service that I want here. So we will see. I don't know that I have as you might tell, because I'm rambling here, is a terrific read on kind of where this will sort of play out and how potent of a force will the consumer really be.
Okay. Great. John, were you done or were we just
Oh, I'm
stopping?
done. I'm sorry.
Okay. I wanted to double check. So we're gonna have some similar questions, but we're gonna take a short break and put up the poll right now
Okay.
for folks who have to leave early, and then we'll continue on. So
I think we're going to
Yeah,
take
we're
just
getting
a few more
close.
seconds. We're getting close. There we go.
All right, great. So, Denny,
Thank
now
you,
do
folks.
other people see those whole results or?
Well, all I could say is they're excellent, John. You would be
Yes.
very pleased if you don't see them yourself. They're excellent. So why don't we
Yeah.
move forward, and we'll
All right,
share
so
these
let's-
results along with other materials that, after the presentation.
Great.
After the
So,
interview.
so there were a couple of other questions related to patient role and patient data. So why don't we go ahead? I think that this question will somewhat be dealt with by the CMS rules that are coming into play, but we did have someone ask about the business model you see for sharing of patient data. It seems like we've been trying to get clinical data shared for decades with minimal success. How do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I think one is if you look at banking, what they did is focus on a very targeted set of transactions for which there was clear business case, not use case, but business case for all the participants. So they focused on banks settling up at the day. But they didn't focus on and they focused on ATMs, standard for ATM. Why? Because after a while, every bank had an ATM, and the average ATM costs average bank 12 grand a year. And so here you had this huge cost that distinguished nobody. So they were trying to defray the costs of the ATM, and they started sharing ATMs across the various networks of Yankee, Sirius, and things like that. So I think in healthcare, the right thing to do is to focus on certain targeted transactions, whether they're patient or not patient, is perhaps less relevant than transactions that are targeted and for which all the participants say there's a clear use case. So, for example, prior authorizations. I mean, Denny, you mentioned that there's a clear use case for this. The second is, we go back to NEHAN, a clear use case for submitting claims electronically for all the participants, and a use case can be the law. The law in this case was HIPAA that required it, et cetera. So there is a clear use case. So I think when you can get that, what's not clear to me, if you say, I want, to broadly share patient data across, across the region or whatever, is people say, in the use case, that's a good idea, but who's going to pay for that? And if you were to knock on the door of every healthcare system, would you pay for it? You might get pretty mixed answers about whether, they got a lot of stuff on their plate, a lot of things they can pay for, whether they would pay for that. Now, they might pay for where we have a strong referral relationship with these guys or this, set of practices. So we're going to change that. But broad is perhaps a bridge too far. So I think it is, there are, what causes use cases to become business cases? One is there's clear return on investment. It's just clearly in my interest of cost or whatever. The second is because the law says to. I may not like it, but the law says it. The third is when a competitor comes in and does it as a way to distinguish themselves, and I worry about falling behind. So all three of those levers, I think we need to do, or to get really broad sharing of patient data. But I'm not sure when that will be and on what time horizon that will be.
All right, great. Obviously we've started coming into regulations that are requiring some of that now. So hopefully that will move things along, at least on the second tier of your three-tiered stool. So the last question that's sort of related is on consent. How do you see managing the consumer and the CMS directions to allow patients to determine who sees what information on a technical and operational level?
Yeah, I appreciate the intention of having Denny can see this and John can't see that, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's operationally very difficult to do and to maintain it, because that obviously can be a fairly fluid situation to do this. So I get the intent. What I don't know is how tractable, frankly, that really is. And also as to, other than certain categories, the category of mental health or substance issue. You might know the category of really dreaded disease. Like, I really don't want people to know that I have cancer. So I might see sort of category exclusion or control. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were done. I'll add one other use case that I bring up with people, and that is getting independent second opinions. That started getting harder in the new world as people automatically see your data, and you can walk in for what you think is an independent second opinion and hear, well, I saw what the other doctor said and it makes sense to me. I'm not even getting an exam.
Yeah, I think it's, they're probably in a list that may start here and then become longer as people realize what we do here. I do think you have to worry about sort of sheer tractability, and obviously
Yep.
getting down to the data element level may be a little bit a bridge too far.
That's fair. All right, let's move on. So actually, you just brought up the banking industry in your last answer, and you talked about it during the talk. And perhaps you already answered this sufficiently in the last answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. And if you have anything else to say, go for it.
Okay.
Your example using the banking industry regarding the impediments to interoperability was great. What are the analogous factors in healthcare delivery?
Yeah, I think what I would do in healthcare is one is follow the three-part. This is what works for banking. You focus, you make sure there's a business case, and you have a forum in which people can get together to debate the issues. And I thought actually use a local microcosm, Nihin. I thought Nihin was great. It focused, and had to because of HIPAA on the transaction set. The business case was clear. There's always time saving, but you also had to comply, frankly, with the law. And there was a place where people could hammer out the operating rules. Who does what when, and if there was capital to be spent, of how much capital, how do we allocate the costs, et cetera. And there's the Nihin committee and governing body that would deal with that. So I think those are the three things that are the three factors that we would look for, across the board if we're sort of applying this to banking here. So my sense is at the federal level is, you could do the interoperability. I think one of the things to be, if you're, for example, Mickey Tripathi, and you're looking at social determinants of health, I think that's the right thing to do. Let's look at what it takes there. The next question is, to what degree is there a business case for doing social determinants of health sharing, et cetera? And how will that happen? And how do I make that happen, et cetera? Because you could do the targeting, but not get far enough along on the business case to do this. And the third is, where is all this, all the back and forth and arm wrestling that goes on the implementation? Where is that happening? Is that the Sequoia project, or where will that particular stuff be happening? So my recommendation, what do I know, would be to replicate those three, sort of key factors for success in the healthcare setting.
Sorry, Dennis, I muted myself for the same reason that you've been muting yourself.
Yeah, that's all right.
So since you mentioned SDOH, we had a question that asked, another topic of widespread interest these days is health equity, and I would bucket SDOH in that as sort of a collective thing. Do you have any observations about that area and your thoughts on where we should go there?
Well, I think, obviously we're, in some ways you might imagine, perhaps we're a little late to the realization of how critical these social factors are. And that we can do something about them. And I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that the health system will boil the ocean and solve all the problems of homelessness or, a substance abuse issue, whatever is going on around there. That being said, there are some real steps that you can take to do that. And whether it is, one, knowing what the factors are. The second is making sure you refer patients to social organizations that can help you, with getting a home or getting a safe house or whatever it might happen to be. And then in routine follow-up care is making sure that whatever services you want pointed them to were actually being, taken advantage of, et cetera. So I think there can be a lot of stuff we can do to make sure that people are aware of their options to deal with the social issues that they can confront. Knowing you're not going to end poverty. You're just not going to do that. The world is not going to do that. The country's not going to do that. Neither are you. Is the health system going to go off and to do that? So there's certain things that we can do. There are ways, and you can collaborate with regional colleagues, of saying, we're going to really try to make a dent in homelessness. And we're really going to try to make a dent in the opioid crisis and how to resolve that, et cetera. So I do think there is this sort of mission orientation, this community orientation that a lot of healthcare has, and it's great that it does. Can be used to address these things. So I'm glad it's gotten the prominence. And obviously, as you've all seen in the pandemic, the sort of differential mortality rates and hospitalization rates across various ethnicities, holy smokes, we got a real problem there. So how we solve it, I don't know. And I don't know that you can fully solve it, but that shouldn't stop us from making particularly big dents in it, either collaboratively or individually as part of different practitioners.
So a follow up on that, I noticed that you did not once mention interoperability or data issues. SDOH and health equity involves going outside of the traditional healthcare system. Do you have any thoughts on how we can extend our efforts to have a true round trip and get that follow up in some type of automated way, how close or how far away you are, or if there are steps you think we can take now in that direction?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And what I don't know is, and I'm not close enough to the work that's, is what are the interoperability needs here? So if I refer you to an organization that will provide financial counseling, I might want to know that you showed up. And I'm a caregiver, and I say, listen, I'm not really in a position to advise you on this, but I just want to make sure that you got this. What other data would I need in order to make sure that that loop has been closed at this point? So what I don't really know is what is the interoperability real needs in order to track and to determine whether the social issue is being addressed or whether my referral to someone else is being taken care of. I can clearly see that you showed up or didn't show up. And so next time I see you, you say, you didn't show up. What's the deal on this kind of stuff here? So anyway, I think it's worth exploring is what are the interoperability real needs that would go on here? And where are they simple? Are they reasonably complicated? And how do we go about making those things happen?
Thank you. Moving on, we had a similar question, sort of on a wide topic of widespread interest. Are there thoughts that you'd care to offer about what we learned about the healthcare system as a result of COVID?
Sure. Yeah, I think we, excuse me, we've learned a lot. One is we've learned that the pace of discovery of the vaccine could be very fast. And that was remarkably fast. And I appreciate that a lot of work had gone into it beforehand, but the pace of discovery. One of the things that I also thought that we learned is, what you find often in health systems is they had to make decisions an awful lot faster than they were making them before. So a lot of the consensus-driven machinery was just put off to the side, says, we got to make a call now and go because we're going to get overwhelmed, by the sort of influx of patients. So they had to make fast decision makings. They also had to experiment rapidly by bringing together, let's try this and let's try that, et cetera. So I think organizations saw that they were, able to move very quickly, to experiment very, very quickly. And they also quite able to be quite flexible because all of a sudden you say, I've got to rearrange the budget. I've got to rearrange priorities to do this, that, and the other. So there's an agility. So I think one of the things we've learned is about the healthcare organizations and systems is they're quite capable of doing all the above. And a number of them are now going through and say, well, geez, the pandemic's not gone. But how do we make sure that those attributes, those muscles we exercise, they remain permanent? So we don't go back quite to our old ways of, too ponderous, for example, to go off and do this. So we learned about that. I think we also learned obviously about and I knew this, but we certainly saw it again, the heroism and the commitment of the frontline workers who, just golly, day in and day out under really horrible situations, and then coming home and having to spend the night in the basement because they didn't want to infect their families. There's some truly remarkable people, out there doing, God's work in lots of ways. So I thought we were reminded vividly of that. And I think, the other thing we sort of have to bear in mind is the sort of hesitancy of a number of people to get vaccines and sort of learning about, attitudes and the role of the internet and misinformation. It's not really a healthcare thing, but it is a healthcare thing. It's to the degree that, going forward, we may have real challenges sort of getting to people about certain messages that need to occur here. So anyway, I think we learned a lot. I think we learned a lot about also we reinforced images of healthcare workers and their extraordinary commitment to the field of caring. We learned about organizations that can move fast and experiment quite well. We learned a lot about the actually continuing need is to have regional collaboration because a lot of collaborations regionally got strengthened because they had to in terms of who's got capacity to do this, that, and the other. So one of the things I hope we do as an industry is step back, and even though we're not done, is self-reflect on how we were changed by this. And in this quote, new normal, how do we make sure that certain things we'd like to have retained are retained?
Well, thank you, John. I think that wraps up the questions that we have for you today. I wanted to ask, or just close our Vantage Point interview with you with just one question. And that question is, if you had, just 30 seconds left in your life, and you wanted to look back on, what was most important? Whom did you cherish? What would you what were the things you wanted to accomplish or you'd want to say? What would those be?
Yeah, fair enough, Denny. And I think all of us should go through this exercise that as you reflect back on your life, what do you want to say about your life? Because there will come the time where we run out of time. All of us will run out of time here. And I think you may have to wait till you're mid-30s or 40 before you have the maturity to make this, but you ought to have that, each of you ought to go off and decide, what is it that I want to say? And anyway, for me, I want to say 5 things. One is that I was madly in love with my wife then as I am now. We've been together for 47 years, and I just like to be that madly in love with her then as I am now. The second is that my 3 daughters will have lives as blessed as mine. I mean, they'll have their own paths and they make their own decisions, but I've been a very fortunate man, to Denny, your first question out of the gate, and I hope they're able to say the same. The third is that, I have been spared crushing poverty and hatred and bigotry and, and real pain, etc. And I hope I'm spared of that. But if I'm not, I hope I deal with it with courage. And the fourth is that the people who I work with will say that I inspired them, taught them, and led them well. And last but not least, number 5 is that the organizations I served were better because I was there. So if I can say all 5 of those things in my last 30 seconds, then I will die with a smile on my face. It will have been a good run.
I think that would have been a good run, John, and it has been a very, very good run, and it continues to be as we learn more from you. And I think especially during a time where so many of us are deeply focused on the blades of grass, if you will, when changes like this have happened before and tumultuous times will come again. But Dr. John Glaser, thank you so much for your time today. And I appreciate your parting thoughts and your thoughtful commentary on your career. And I wish you and all of you in our audience the very best.
Well, Denny, thanks for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure, and my regards to all of you. And I hope you found these discussions and comments interesting. And I want to thank you for all the work that you have done to improve healthcare and all the work that you will do. So anyway, thank all of you, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thank you all. We're adjourned.